Ophelia Windsor barely had a moment to breathe as she hurried through the crowded airport cafe. Her phone pressed to her ear while she balanced a steaming cup of black coffee in her other hand. "Yes, Richard, I already signed the contract. The Tokyo deal is secure," she said, her voice brisk and efficient. As the CEO of Windsor Enterprises, she was used to moving at lightning speed. There was always another meeting, another investment, another flight. Her life was carefully orchestrated, every second accounted for. She had no time for distractions. Which was why she didn't notice when her passport slipped from her designer purse and landed on the cafe floor. Across the cafe, Adrian Calloway watched the entire thing unfold. He had just set his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, up with a chocolate croissant when he saw the elegant woman stride past, completely unaware of what she had dropped. Adrian sighed, shaking his head as he stood. "Stay here, sweetheart. Daddy's going to help someone real quick." He picked up the passport and his eyebrows lifted slightly at the name inside. Ophelia Windsor. He didn't follow business news much, but even he had heard of her, one of the youngest, most successful CEOs in the country. And judging by the way she was marching toward her gate, she had no idea she had lost something very important. Without hesitation, Adrian took off after her. "Excuse me." "Miss Windsor." Ophelia barely heard him over the chaos of the airport, but then a strong hand lightly touched her arm. She turned sharply, her blue eyes flashing with impatience until she saw the man standing before her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had dark brown hair that was slightly tousled, as if he had just run his fingers through it. His hazel eyes held an easy warmth, but there was something rugged about him, something grounded. "I think you dropped this," Adrian said, holding up her passport. Ophelia blinked, then gasped. "Oh my God!" She snatched it from his hand and flipped it open, relief flooding her face. "I thank you, I didn't even realize." Adrian chuckled. "Yeah, you looked pretty busy." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You have no idea, I would have been stranded without this." She finally looked up at him properly. "I owe you one, Mr. Calloway, Adrian Calloway." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. She had expected a businessman, maybe even a fellow executive, but his casual button-down and jeans told a different story. "Well, Adrian Calloway, you just saved my entire trip." He gave her an easy smile. "Glad I could help." Before either of them could say another word, a small voice called out from behind him. "Daddy, are we still getting on the plane?" Ophelia's gaze shifted past him, and her heart did something strange in her chest. A little girl with curly brown hair and big hazel eyes, Adrian's exact eyes, was standing near a cafe table, her tiny hands gripping a stuffed bunny. Adrian turned back and smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart, just a second." Something about the way he looked at his daughter made Ophelia's throat tighten. She had spent her entire life building an empire, chasing one achievement after the next. She had never slowed down long enough to think about family, much less children. "You're traveling with your daughter?" she asked before she could stop herself. Adrian nodded. "Yeah, just a short trip. A little adventure, right, Lily?" Lily beamed. "Daddy says we're going to see the ocean." Ophelia felt something warm bloom in her chest. There was an ease between them, a deep love that was so obvious it almost took her breath away. Adrian glanced at the departure board and sighed. "Well, looks like we should get going." "It was nice meeting you, Ophelia." She hesitated, something inside her whispering that she didn't want this conversation to end, which was absurd. She had a company to run, a flight to catch. But before she could say anything, an announcement echoed through the terminal. "Attention passengers on Flight 218 to New York. Due to unforeseen circumstances, your flight has been delayed by 3 hours." Ophelia groaned. "Fantastic," Adrian chuckled. "Guess the universe wants you to slow down for a minute." She shot him a look, but there was no malice in it, just something playful, something she wasn't used to feeling. Lily tugged on her father's hand. "Can we get more croissants, Daddy?" Adrian glanced at Ophelia. "You want to join us? It's the least I can do after returning your passport." Ophelia hesitated. She had emails to answer, calls to make. But then she looked at Lily's hopeful face, and for some reason she found herself saying, "You know what? Why not?" As they walked back to the cafe, Ophelia couldn't shake the feeling that this delay wasn't just an inconvenience, it was something else, something she hadn't seen coming. Ophelia stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze flickering between Adrian and Lily as they sat across from her in the cafe. The energy between father and daughter was effortless, unspoken understandings, small gestures of affection. Adrian tore off a piece of his kvass and placed it on Lily's plate without a word, and she beamed up at him as though he had handed her the world. The simplicity of it all was so foreign to Ophelia that she barely realized she was staring. "You don't slow down much, do you?" Adrian asked, lifting an eyebrow as he took a sip of his drink. Ophelia blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you say that?" He gestured toward her phone, which sat face up on the table, notifications lighting up the screen every few seconds. "You've checked that thing at least 10 times in the last 5 minutes." She exhaled sharply and flipped the phone over. Running a company doesn't exactly allow for much downtime. Lily, who had been focused on finishing her croissant, looked up curiously. "What's a company?" Adrian chuckled. "It's like a really big job where you have to make lots of decisions." Lily's eyes widened. "Like what kind of decisions?" Ophelia hesitated. She was used to boardroom negotiations and high-stakes acquisitions, not explaining business to a 5-year-old. "Well, I decide things like where we open new offices, who we hire, what products we invest in." Lily considered this for a moment. "That sounds like a lot of work." "It is." Ophelia surprised herself with how softly she said it. Adrian studied her, something unreadable in his expression. "And do you enjoy it?" Ophelia opened her mouth to answer automatically. Of course she did. She had spent her entire life building Windsor enterprises, but the words didn't come as easily as they should have. Instead, she found herself thinking about the nights spent alone in her penthouse, the constant pressure to be perfect, the endless cycle of meetings that left her drained. "I do," she said finally, but even to her own ears, the conviction didn't sound as strong as it once had. Adrian didn't push. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed. "Lily and I are on our way to Florida. She's never seen the ocean before." Lily bounced excitedly in her seat. "Daddy says the water goes on forever." Ophelia smiled at the little girl's enthusiasm. "It does, in a way. Have you ever been on a boat?" Lily shook her head vigorously. "No, but I want to." "Daddy says maybe next time." Adrian shot his daughter an amused look. "We're starting with the beach first, kiddo." Ophelia couldn't remember the last time she had taken a vacation. Even when she traveled, it was strictly for business. The idea of going somewhere just to enjoy herself was almost laughable. "What about you?" Adrian asked. "Where are you headed?" "New York." "Meetings, investors, the usual." He nodded, but there was something in his expression that made her feel like he saw straight through her. "You ever take a trip just for fun?" She hesitated. "Not in a long time," Lily gasped dramatically. "That's so sad. Daddy says trips are important." Ophelia chuckled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her coffee. "Your dad sounds very wise." Adrian grinned. "I try." The conversation drifted into lighter topics. Lily's favorite animals, the best desserts in the world, according to her. It was chocolate cake with extra sprinkles, and Adrian's childhood spent in a small coastal town. Ophelia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, but reality came crashing back when her phone buzzed insistently against the table. She sighed and glanced at the screen. A message from her assistant. "Urgent call the board immediately." She exhaled, her shoulders tensing. "I should take this." Adrian inclined his head. "Of course." Lily pouted. "Will you come back?" Ophelia hesitated, something tugging at her that she couldn't quite name. "I'll try." As she stepped away, phone pressed to her ear, she barely heard the words coming from the other end of the line. Her mind was still back at the table. with a little girl who had never seen the ocean and a man who looked at life differently than anyone she had ever known. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than boardrooms and deals. Ophelia returned to the cafe nearly an hour later, her mind still spinning from the heated conversation with her board members. The Tokyo deal had hit an unexpected snag, and while she had managed to keep everything from falling apart, the stress of it sat heavy on her shoulders. But the moment she spotted Adrian and Lily still seated at their table, something inside her eased. Lily was now coloring on a napkin with a small pack of crayons, and Adrian was watching her with a quiet fondness. The peacefulness in their little world was such a stark contrast to the chaos of her own that she found herself drawn back to them without hesitation. Adrian looked up as she approached, his gaze assessing. "Everything all right?" Ophelia let out a breath, setting her phone down on the table. Crisis averted. "For now." Lily held up her napkin proudly. "Look, I drew a boat." Ophelia leaned in, studying the child's artwork. It was a simple drawing, but there was a charm to it that made her smile. "That's a very impressive boat. Are you going to be a sailor?" Lily giggled. "Maybe, but Daddy says I can be anything I want." Adrian reached over, tucking a stray curl behind his daughter's ear. "That's right, kiddo." Something about the exchange struck Ophelia in a way she hadn't expected. She had grown up in a world where expectations were set in stone, where every step of her life had been carefully mapped out. There had never been room for dreaming beyond what was practical, what was necessary. She glanced at Adrian, curiosity tugging at her. "What about you? Did you always want to do whatever it is you do?" His lips quirked slightly. "That depends. What do you think I do?" Ophelia considered him. He didn't carry himself like a businessman, at least not in the way she was accustomed to. There was an ease to him, a grounded confidence that set him apart from the men in her world. "You don't strike me as someone who spends his days in a boardroom," Adrian chuckled. "That's a polite way of saying I don't look like a corporate guy." She tilted her head, intrigued. "So, what is it?" He leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I run a small renovation business, mostly houses, sometimes commercial spaces. Nothing flashy, but it keeps me busy." Ophelia hadn't expected that. She had assumed he had a more traditional career, something closer to her own world. But the idea of him working with his hands, creating something tangible, made a strange kind of sense. "That explains the calluses," she mused, eyeing his hands. Adrian lifted his brows. "You noticed," she shrugged. "I pay attention." There was something in the way he looked at her, then something deeper, more searching. It made her pulse quicken in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. "So, you build things," she said, steering the conversation forward. "That's a different kind of pressure than what I deal with." He nodded. "Yeah, but it's still problem-solving. Every job comes with unexpected challenges." "You just figure it out as you go." Ophelia considered that. "I don't think I've ever had the luxury of figuring things out as I go. Everything in my world has to be planned down to the last detail." Adrian studied her for a moment. "That sounds exhausting." She let out a soft laugh. "You have no idea." Lily tapped her crayon against the table. "Maybe you should take a break," Ophelia chuckled. "If only it were that simple." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "Maybe it is." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. The idea of stepping away, even briefly, had always seemed impossible. But sitting here, in this unexpected pocket of time, with a man who saw the world so differently, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Before she could respond, an announcement echoed through the terminal. "Attention passengers on Flight 218 to New York. Your flight is now boarding at Gate B5. Ophelia felt a strange pang of disappointment. She had spent her life chasing the next big move, the next opportunity. And yet, for the first time in years, she didn't want to leave. Adrian must have noticed the hesitation in her expression because he spoke before she could. "You sure you want to get on that plane?" she exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I don't think I have a choice. Lily frowned. But you just got here. Ophelia smiled at the little girl's earnestness. I know, sweetheart. Adrian held her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. Well, if you ever find yourself needing a break from all that planning, maybe you should come see the ocean. Her breath caught slightly at the quiet invitation in his words. And for the first time in a long time, she found herself considering something completely unplanned. Ophelia stood at the boarding gate, her fingers tightening around her passport. The flight attendants were calling for first-class passengers to board, but she remained rooted in place. Her mind was a battlefield of logic and impulse, her carefully constructed world clashing against something entirely new, something that made her pulse race in a way no business deal ever had. She had spent years making the safe, strategic choices, decisions based on profit margins and calculated risks. And yet, for the first time in her life, she didn't want to follow the plan. A voice behind her pulled her from her thoughts. You don't look like someone excited to get on that plane. She turned to find Adrian standing a few feet away, his daughter's small hand wrapped in his. Lily was gazing up at her with hopeful eyes, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly to her chest. Ophelia exhaled a slow breath. I should go. Adrian studied her, his expression unreadable. But do you want to? The question settled in her chest, heavier than she expected. Lily tugged at her father's sleeve. Can she come with us, Daddy? Adrian let out a soft chuckle before looking at Ophelia again. What do you think, CEO? You up for an unscheduled detour? She should have laughed. She should have given him an apologetic smile and told him she had meetings, responsibilities, that she couldn't possibly change her plans on a whim. But instead, she found herself saying something entirely different. What if I did? Adrian's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but before he could respond, the final boarding call for her flight echoed through the terminal. Ophelia turned to glance at the gate one last time, her heart pounding. It would be so easy to step forward, to take her assigned seat and return to the world she had always known. But something inside her whispered that if she did, she would regret it. She turned back to Adrian and Lily, her decision made. Looks like I'm going to the ocean. Lily squealed in delight, and Adrian let out a quiet, surprised laugh. You sure about this? Ophelia met his gaze, feeling lighter than she had in years. For once, I have no idea, but I think I want to find out. The plane ride was unexpectedly peaceful. After a lifetime of business travel filled with back-to-back emails and last-minute presentation edits, sitting beside Adrian and Lily felt entirely different. Lily spent most of the flight coloring in a small activity book, occasionally showing Ophelia her drawings with unfiltered enthusiasm. Adrian, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he was used to letting life unfold at its own pace. At one point, Adrian turned to her, his voice low enough to keep from waking Lily, who had dozed off against his arm. You ever do something like this before? Just go somewhere without a plan? Ophelia shook her head, a quiet smile playing at her lips. Not once. Adrian studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. You don't seem like you regret it. She looked down at the sleeping child beside him, then back up at the man whose presence had somehow unraveled everything she thought she knew about herself. I don't. The beach was breathtaking. The moment they arrived, Lily ran toward the waves with pure, unfiltered joy, her laughter carried by the salty breeze. Ophelia stood beside Adrian, the sand warm beneath her bare feet. The two of them watched as Lily chased the tide, her small footprints disappearing with each retreating wave. You know, Adrian said, his voice thoughtful, I wasn't expecting today to go like this. Ophelia let out a quiet laugh. Neither was I. He turned to her then, his hazel eyes searching hers. But you don't seem like someone who regrets unexpected things. She met his gaze, feeling something shift inside her, something irrevocable. Not when they lead to moments like this. Adrian exhaled slowly, his expression softening. You're different than I expected. She tilted her head slightly. How so? I figured someone like you, someone with all the power and control you have, would be colder. He hesitated, then added, but you're not. Ophelia felt her breath catch. It was rare for anyone to see past the polished exterior she had spent years perfecting. But Adrian did. He saw her in a way no one else ever had. Before she could respond, Lily came running back, her face flushed with excitement. Daddy, Ophelia, the water is so cold but so fun. Ophelia smiled down at her. It looks amazing. Lily grabbed her hand without hesitation. Come feel it. For once, Ophelia didn't think she just followed. The water was freezing as it rushed over her feet, but the sensation was exhilarating. She let out a surprised laugh, and Lily giggled beside her. Adrian stood a few feet away, watching them with something warm and unreadable in his expression. Ophelia met his gaze, and in that moment, she knew. She had spent her life chasing success, believing that happiness was something she could achieve only after reaching the next milestone, the next victory. But here, on this beach, with sand between her toes and laughter ringing in the air, she realized she had been wrong. Happiness wasn't something she had to earn. It was something she had just found, and she wasn't letting it go. The sun had started to dip toward the horizon, casting golden streaks across the sky as Ophelia stood ankle-deep in the water. The waves lapped at her feet, cool and insistent, as though urging her forward into something unknown. Lily had exhausted herself running up and down the shore, and now she was curled up on a beach towel, her stuffed bunny clutched in her arms as she dozed. Adrian had draped his light jacket over her, his movements instinctive, filled with quiet care. Ophelia had never seen anything quite like it, this effortless tenderness, this unwavering presence. It was a stark contrast to the world she had come from, where affection was measured, calculated, something to be earned rather than freely given. She turned her gaze toward Adrian, who stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets as he watched the waves. The wind tousled his hair, and there was a thoughtful stillness about him, as though he belonged here in a way that she never had anywhere. You don't seem like the kind of man who leaves things to chance, she said, watching him closely. Adrian glanced at her, his hazel eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. And what kind of man do I seem like? She considered her answer, letting the breeze carry away the hesitation. One who chooses his path carefully, someone who knows what truly matters. He exhaled a slow and measured breath. I didn't always, he admitted. There was a time when I thought success meant running toward the biggest opportunity, the next big thing. But then life happened. Plans changed. And I realized the things you build with your own hands, the people you hold close, those are the only things that last. Ophelia felt something shift inside her. That's not a lesson most people learn easily. Adrian gave a small nod. Losing Lily's mom forced me to figure it out fast. She turned fully to him at that, sensing the weight behind his words. He had never mentioned Lily's mother before, and she hadn't asked not out of disinterest, but out of respect. What happened? She asked gently. He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. But then, with a quietness that carried years of acceptance, he said, she passed away shortly after Lily was born. Complications during surgery. It was sudden. Ophelia's chest tightened. I'm sorry. He gave a small nod, his gaze still on the water. At first, I didn't know how to do it alone. I was terrified of messing up, of not being enough for her. But then I realized really being there was what mattered most. She swallowed, emotions swirling inside her. You're an incredible father. Adrian finally looked at her then, searching her face. And what about you? She blinked. What about me? Do you think you've been living for the right things? The question settled deep within her, heavier than she expected. She had spent years chasing a version of success that left little room for anything else. Every decision had been about growth, about proving herself, about making Windsor Enterprises an unshakable force. But standing here, with the salt air in her lungs and a sleeping child a few feet away, she realized something startling. She had never truly stopped to ask herself if she was happy. Ophelia turned her gaze back to the waves, the answer forming in the quiet space between them. I don't know anymore. Adrian didn't speak, didn't try to offer solutions or pretty words. He just stood beside her, letting the moment exist. And somehow, that was enough. As the evening deepened, they gathered their things, shaking the sand from towels and slipping on their shoes. Lily stirred, rubbing her sleepy eyes as she clung to her stuffed bunny. "Daddy, can we get ice cream before bed?" she mumbled. Adrian chuckled. "You've got room for ice cream after today." Lily nodded, her determination unwavering. "Always." Ophelia smiled, something warm settling in her chest. "I think that's a philosophy I can get behind." Adrian's gaze lingered on her, something unreadable in his expression. "Then let's go find the best ice cream this town has to offer." They walked through the small coastal streets, the scent of the ocean still clinging to their skin. The town was quaint, filled with locally owned shops that glowed warmly under string lights. They found a small creamery tucked between two boutiques, and within minutes, Lily was happily devouring a cone of strawberry ice cream, her eyes half lidded with exhaustion but her excitement still unwavering. Adrian and Ophelia sat at a nearby bench, their own cones in hand. She took a slow bite, letting the cold sweetness settle on her tongue. "This is." She started, then paused, searching for the right word. "Simple," Adrian offered. She nodded, "but perfect." He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You could have been in a boardroom right now." She let out a quiet laugh. "I know. And yet you're here." Ophelia turned to him, her expression serious, "and I don't regret it." Adrian's gaze softened, something shifting in the air between them. "Then maybe you've already started answering your own question." She didn't reply, but she didn't have to. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about the next move, the next deal, the next step. She was just here, and for once, that was enough. The air outside the ice cream shop was crisp, carrying the scent of salt water and something faintly sweet from the nearby bakeries. Ophelia walked beside Adrian as they strolled through the quiet streets, Lily nestled in his arms, her small face tucked against his shoulder as she slept. The world around them had slowed, the hum of life reduced to the distant crash of waves and the occasional laughter of late-night wanderers. This was a kind of peace Ophelia had never known. They reached Adrian's rental house, a cozy beachfront cottage with soft porch lights glowing against the night. He shifted Lily carefully, retrieving the keys from his pocket while Ophelia lingered at the bottom of the steps. "You don't have to rush off," Adrian said, glancing at her as he unlocked the door. His voice was steady, but there was something in his gaze, an unspoken hope, a quiet invitation. Ophelia hesitated, knowing she should go back to her hotel, that this entire day had been an unexpected detour from her carefully structured life. But standing here, with the ocean a constant whisper behind them, and a man who had somehow unraveled all her walls without even trying, she found herself unwilling to leave. "I'll stay for a little while," she said softly. Adrian nodded, stepping inside with Lily. Ophelia followed, taking in the house's warmth, the well-worn furniture, the faint scent of cedar and salt, the lived-in comfort that felt miles away from the sterile perfection of her penthouse. Adrian carried Lily to her room, reappearing moments later with a quiet ease, as if fatherhood had become second nature to him. He found her standing by the open window, watching the waves roll in under the moonlight. "You look like someone with a lot on her mind," he said, stepping beside her. Ophelia exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the wood of the windowsill. "I think today was the first time in years I didn't know what came next." Adrian leaned against the frame, studying her. "And how did that feel?" She turned to him, the answer settling in her chest before she even spoke. "Like freedom." The words felt like a quiet revelation, and Adrian didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. He simply let them exist between them, his presence steady, grounding. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now. "You don't have to go back tomorrow." Ophelia's heart stuttered. I have responsibilities. I know, he said, watching her carefully. But maybe for once, they can wait. She wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, that her life didn't allow for spontaneity, but hadn't today proven otherwise? Hadn't she already broken free from the script she had followed for so long? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp reminder of the world she had momentarily left behind. She didn't move to check it. Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the windowsill. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but it sent a quiet thrill through her. "What are you afraid of, Ophelia?" She met his gaze, the question settling deep. "I don't know," she admitted, and for the first time it wasn't a terrifying thought, it was liberating. Adrian's lips curved slightly, something warm flickering in his eyes. "Then maybe that's your answer." The distance between them lessened, the space charged with something unspoken. Ophelia's pulse quickened, not with uncertainty, but with something far more exhilarating, a want, a need she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. And then, as if drawn by the same force, Adrian closed the remaining space between them. His hand came up, fingers grazing her cheek, his touch slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she leaned into it, into him, into the quiet understanding that had been building between them from the moment he had handed her back her passport. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't hurried or desperate, it was steady, sure, like he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. His lips were warm against hers, his hand sliding to the small of her back, pulling her closer. Ophelia melted into him, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as the world outside the window faded into nothing. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers in the quiet space between them. "Stay," he murmured. And for once, Ophelia didn't think she just listened to what her heart had been telling her all along. "I will." The days that followed were unlike anything Ophelia had ever experienced. Mornings filled with coffee on the porch, afternoons spent with sand between her toes, evenings wrapped in a warmth she hadn't known she was missing. She watched as Lily built sandcastles, her laughter ringing out like music. She walked hand in hand with Adrian along the shore, their conversations stretching into the night. For the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing anything, she was simply living. And when the inevitable call came from her company, asking when she would return, she surprised even herself with her answer. "I'll be back soon," she told them. But not yet. Adrian was watching her when she hung up, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes. Because for once, I made the decision for myself." A slow smile spread across his face and he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "So what now?" he asked, his voice filled with something hopeful. Ophelia looked out at the waves, then back at the man who had changed everything. "Now," she said, squeezing his hand, "I figure it out as I go." Adrian's smile deepened, and as he pulled her into another kiss, Ophelia knew this wasn't just a detour. This was exactly where she was meant to be, and for the first time in her life, she was finally home.